Karen Carpenter died on February 4th, 1983, and the man who'd spent the previous year trying to keep her alive found out from the radio. Stephen Levenkron, the New York psychotherapist who'd treated her anorexia through 1982, later said it felt like losing a patient he thought he understood. He didn't. Nobody around her fully did. And that gap between what her doctors knew and what the public was told is the real story here. Not the collapse itself, but the 20-some years it took for anyone to say plainly what had actually happened to her heart. Start with what the coroner announced 5 weeks after she died. On March 11, 1983, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office released a cause of death: emetine cardiotoxicity due to or as a consequence of anorexia nervosa. Reporters and fans read that phrase and mostly didn't know what to do with it. It sounded clinical and vague at once. A chemical name, an underlying disease, no clear story connecting the two. Her blood sugar at time of death had measured over 10 times the normal level. There was no drug overdose, the autopsy said. So what killed her, exactly, remained technically named but practically unexplained to almost everyone who read about it. The unexplained part had a reason. Emetine is the toxic compound in ipecac syrup. The over-the-counter emetic drugstores sold for decades so parents could induce vomiting in children who'd swallowed something poisonous. It works on skeletal and cardiac muscle the same way. It doesn't distinguish between a stomach that needs emptying once and a heart that's been forced to absorb the drug's damage over and over. 2 years after Karen's death, in 1985, the coroner told colleagues privately that her heart failure had been caused by repeated ipecac use. Levenkron disputed it. He said he'd never known her to use ipecac and hadn't seen evidence she'd been vomiting under his care. Her friends had their own theory: laxatives and thyroid medication, misused for years to keep her weight down, worsened after her marriage fell apart. 3 explanations, 3 sources, none of them fully reconciled in public for a very long time. To understand why nobody could agree, you have to go back to what actually happened inside Lennox Hill Hospital in Manhattan in the fall of 1982, because that's where the clearest warnings on record were given, and where the gap between medical reality and public narrative opened up. She checked in that September at 77 pounds, on a 5'4" frame, severely dehydrated with dangerously low potassium. Her digestive system had essentially stopped functioning normally after years of restriction, purging, and laxative abuse. Whichever combination of those was operating by then, and probably more than one was, doctors put her on intravenous parenteral nutrition, feeding her directly through a line since her body could no longer be trusted to process food safely on its own. At one point, a feeding tube meant to nourish her instead punctured one of her lungs. An accident, but a telling one. A reminder of how compromised her body had become by then. Over about 8 weeks, she gained 30 pounds. That number gets repeated in almost every account of her final months, usually as a sign of recovery. It wasn't only that, rapid refeeding after prolonged starvation puts enormous strain on a heart that has, by then, often shrunk and weakened along with the rest of the body. A real and recognized medical danger, not an incidental detail. Her heart had already been operating under years of malnutrition. Now it was being asked to support a body regaining mass faster than it had lost it. What did the doctors treating her say about that, specifically, to her family? I haven't found a preserved transcript of that conversation, and I don't think one exists in any source available now. Hospital rooms don't get recorded, and the people in them are gone or have never given a detailed public account of that particular exchange. What's documented is the shape of it, that her heart was already weak, that the weight gain was putting additional strain on it, and that continuing the pattern she'd lived by for years carried real cardiac risk. Whether that was delivered to Richard and her parents as a soft caution or an urgent warning, whether it used the word "could die" or something gentler, isn't something any source I can find pins down with a direct quote. What we do know is what happened next, and it tells you something about how the message landed either way. She was discharged before Thanksgiving. She seemed, by every account, genuinely better. She gave her doctor a small gift, an embroidered message reading, "You win, I win." She flew back to California determined to finalize her divorce from Tom Burris, restart her career, and get into the studio with Richard for a new album. On December 17th, she sang Christmas carols at the Buckley School in Sherman Oaks for her godchildren and their classmates. Her last public singing performance, though nobody in that room had reason to think of it that way yet. On January 11th, 1983, she showed up at a gathering marking the Grammy Awards' 25th anniversary. She looked frail. Dionne Warwick, who was there, remembered her being upbeat about it anyway, telling people to look at her, that she'd finally put on some weight. On February 1st, she saw Richard for what turned out to be the last time, and they talked about the new record. 3 days later, she was dead. She'd risen early that morning at her parents' house in Downey, apparently meaning to sort through some old clothes, and collapsed in a walk-in closet. Paramedics found her heart beating roughly once every 10 seconds. She was pronounced dead at Downey Community Hospital just before 10 in the morning. She was 32. The public story that formed in the days after her death was, understandably, simple. A young singer with a much-loved voice had died of heart failure connected to anorexia, a disease that at the time most Americans barely had language for. That was true, and it was also the edge of what anyone was saying. The coroner's phrase, emetine cardiotoxicity, sat in newspaper coverage without much unpacking. It would be 2 more years before that coroner told colleagues, off the record, what emetine actually meant in her case, and even that admission stayed mostly inside professional circles rather than becoming a headline. Levenkron's public disagreement muddied it further. For a story that should have been straightforwardly tragic, the actual mechanism of her death spent years sitting in a kind of fog, known to a small circle of doctors and therapists, disputed among them, and never fully assembled for the people who'd bought her records and mourned her on the radio. Some of that fog served a purpose. A year after her death, the Carpenter family established a foundation in her name aimed at anorexia awareness, and Richard has spoken since about wanting the focus to stay on the music rather than the illness, a preference he stated plainly in interviews decades later, saying he'd rather people remember 2 kids from the suburbs who found a sound together than dwell on how it ended. That's a defensible instinct for a grieving brother. It also meant that for a long time, the fullest account of what her doctors actually knew, how bad her heart already was by 1982, what the ipecac was doing to her in her final weeks, whether anyone around her recognized the specific danger she was in during that last winter, came out in pieces through people with their own reasons to tell it carefully or not at all. The pieces that did surface are worth naming. 2 years after her death, a coalition of doctors and eating disorder specialists lobbied the FDA to restrict over-the-counter sales of ipecac syrup, arguing that tens of thousands of young women were misusing a drug that had never been flagged as a substance of abuse before. Levenkron told the New York Times at the time that some users were going through several bottles a day, and that somewhere between 50 and 250 bottles could be fatal depending on the person. In a radio interview afterward, reflecting on Karen specifically, he said something close to this, that she'd probably believed what she was doing was harmless, and that in something like 60 days she had, in effect, killed herself without meaning to. That's about as direct as any of the people who actually treated her ever got, on the record, about what she'd done to her own heart in her final stretch of life. And it still didn't come until after the FDA campaign had already started, already years past her death. The full connected account, hospital records, interviews with people who'd been in the room, an attempt to reconcile the coroner's private admission with Levenkron's denial with the friend's laxative theory, didn't really exist as a single accessible narrative until Randy Schmidt's biography, published in 2010. That's 27 years after she died, near enough to the buried for 20 years framing that it's worth being precise about what was actually withheld and by whom. Nobody organized a cover-up in the sense of a locked file cabinet. What happened instead was quieter and, in a way, more human. A family that wanted a different emphasis, a therapist defending his own account of his patient's care, a coroner who apparently felt safer sharing his real conclusion with colleagues than with the press, and a public that had been handed a clinical phrase in 1983 and largely stopped asking what it meant. Nobody had to bury anything actively. It just never got dug up until someone decided to do the digging properly. What that digging eventually showed was a woman whose doctors, as early as September 1982, already understood her heart was in serious danger, and a family that, whatever they were told in that hospital, spent the next several months watching her seem to get better, sing carols, joke at a Grammy party, plan an album. If there was a warning given to them in plain terms, it existed alongside a genuine, visible recovery that made the warning easy to file away rather than act on with the urgency it probably deserved. That's not a story about people choosing to hide the truth. It's closer to a story about how a real warning and a real remission can sit in the same house at the same time, and how easy it is to believe the remission because you want to. Levenkron's line about 60 days stayed with me while going through this. It implies a period, roughly the last 2 months of her life, during which whatever was happening to her heart was actively, measurably progressing, even while she was telling friends she felt stronger and planning a tour. Nobody around her, including the professionals, seems to have clocked that overlap while it was happening. It only became visible in hindsight once someone put the hospital admission next to the autopsy next to the coroner's later admission next to Levenkron's own account and lined up the dates. If you're going through something similar to what Karen Carpenter experienced, or you're worried about someone who might be, the National Alliance for Eating Disorders operates a helpline, and it's a reasonable place to start.